I didn't know a marriage could rot in total silence. No bruises, no lipstick on a collar, no late-night work trips that didn't add up. Just a slow, almost invisible shift, like the air in my own house had been replaced with something thinner, colder, and I was the only one struggling to breathe. People still ask me about us like we were a success story. How's married life, Claire? Still happy? And I, 38, running the hardware store my late father once owned, proud of the routines Paul and I built, would smile and say, "We're solid." Because from the outside, we were. Paul, 37, an accountant at a mid-sized firm downtown. The practical one, the list maker, the one who remembered birthdays and dentist appointments and kept our life running like a spreadsheet. Me, more laid back. Weekend cooking. Date night every other Friday at that old Italian place near our neighborhood that's somehow survived since the 80s. A 3-bedroom house in the suburbs. No kids, by choice. One orange tabby cat named Winston, who'd been with us since he was 2. That was the picture. But 4 months ago, Paul didn't brake when a dog ran across the highway. He actually pressed the gas, just a little, then shrugged like it was nothing. 6 weeks ago, he stared at our neighbor's 12-year-old like the kid was something stuck to his shoe and shut the door in his face. A month ago, Winston knocked over a glass of water and Paul grabbed him by the scruff, lifted him in the air, and stared into his eyes like he was deciding something. I kept telling myself I was overreacting. Until 2 weeks ago, my father's pocket watch disappeared. That watch wasn't just a thing. It was grief with a heartbeat. A 1952 heirloom that I wound every few days because it made me feel like my dad hadn't completely left. I tore our bedroom apart searching for it, hands shaking, throat tight, while Paul folded laundry on the bed and said no, without even looking up. Then, after 20 minutes of watching me spiral, he casually told me he'd moved it for safekeeping, as if my panic was interesting, as if my fear was entertainment. Yesterday morning, I found his black notebook under the bed, and the first line I saw, before I even meant to read anything, had my name in it. That was the moment I realized the man I married might be a stranger who's been studying me for years. If you'd met me 10 years ago, you would have thought I was the kind of woman who always had a plan. I wasn't. I just learned early that if I didn't build structure around my life, something else, someone else, would build it for me. My name is Claire. I'm 38. And I manage a hardware store on the edge of town, the same store my father once ran, like it was a small kingdom made of nails, lumber, and quiet pride. He wasn't a man of big speeches. He was a man of steady hands. When he died 3 years ago, it didn't feel like a dramatic ending. It felt like someone turned off a light I'd been using to find my way home. The store was my anchor after that. Early mornings, inventory lists, the smell of sawdust that clung to my hair, no matter how many showers I took. Regular customers who asked about my dad with the same soft expression, like they were trying not to step on my grief. And then there was Paul. We met 15 years ago at a friend's birthday dinner, one of those crowded restaurant tables where you end up talking to the person next to you simply because there's nowhere else to look. Paul was neat, crisp, the kind of man who folded his napkin in his lap like it mattered. He listened more than he spoke. When he laughed, it was controlled, like he only allowed himself a certain amount of joy at a time. I remember thinking, he's calm, he'll be safe. I didn't fall for him like lightning. It was slower than that, like realizing you'd been warming your hands near a fire without noticing when you sat down. Paul remembered details, the name of my favorite coffee, the fact that I hated loud bars, the way I always apologized when I didn't need to. He noticed things, and back then it felt like being seen. He worked in accounting, climbing steadily. I was still helping my dad at the store then, learning the business from the ground up. Paul admired my work ethic. I admired his precision. It felt balanced, like we filled in each other's gaps without trying to change the other person. We married 9 years ago in a small ceremony, nothing extravagant. Paul's parents loved the idea of him settling down with a stable woman. My family loved that he was polite, predictable, responsible. Everyone used those words like compliments. And in the beginning, it was good. We chose not to have children early on, not because we hated kids, but because we wanted peace. My childhood had enough chaos for a lifetime. And Paul never expressed the slightest pull toward fatherhood. When friends announced pregnancies, he smiled at the right moments, asked the right questions, and then looked relieved when we got back into the car like we'd escaped a social obligation. Our days became routines. Paul handled the bills and calendars because he liked control, and I liked not having to think about it. I cooked on weekends because that felt like love to me. He cooked during the week because he got home earlier and liked following recipes the way other people followed religion. Exact measurements, exact timing, no improvisation. Every other Friday was date night at the old Italian place near our house. Same booth if it was available. Same waiter who joked that we were the most consistent couple on the schedule. Paul always tipped properly, always said thank you, always smiled. The thing is, Paul was always good at being the version of himself people expected. With my friends, he was charming in small, controlled doses. With my family, he asked about everyone's jobs and remembered follow-ups, like he had a mental file cabinet labeled Claire's People. At holidays, he offered to do dishes before anyone asked, and my mother would whisper to me, "You're lucky." I believed her, because in the quiet of our house, Paul wasn't cruel, he wasn't loud, he didn't hit walls or slam doors. He didn't disappear for nights at a time. He was just hard to read. There were moments, tiny ones, that I'd brushed off. The way he didn't soften around animals the way most people did. The way he could watch someone cry and remain strangely untouched, like he was observing a scene through glass. I told myself that was just his personality, that not everyone loved loudly. But now, looking back, I keep circling the same question like a sore tooth. Was he always like this and I just called it practical? The first time I felt something crack, it was so small I almost laughed at myself for noticing. We were driving back from Paul's parents' house, 3 hours on the highway, late afternoon light stretching long and thin across the road. The visit had been fine, polite, controlled. His mother had asked about work. His father had commented on the weather like it was a moral stance. Paul had slipped back into the version of himself he used around them, agreeable, mild, slightly distant. About 50 yards ahead of us, a dog bolted across the highway. I sucked in a breath and instinctively pressed my foot down on the imaginary brake on the passenger side. Paul didn't slow. If anything, he sped up, just a fraction. Not enough to be reckless, enough to be deliberate. The dog made it across, my heart kept racing anyway. "Why didn't you brake?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light, like this was casual curiosity and not something clawing at my ribs. Paul shrugged, eyes still forward. It shouldn't have been loose. That was it. No tension in his voice, no adrenaline, just commentary, like he was pointing out a traffic sign. I told myself I was tired, that weekends with his parents always drained me. I didn't push. Then came the neighbor's kid. A Saturday morning, the kind where the air still feels new and you haven't ruined the day yet. I was standing in the hallway when the knock came. Paul answered the door. The boy, maybe 12, held a flyer he'd clearly made himself, printed at home, crooked margins, hope written all over his face. He explained his rates, his plan, his goal of saving for a gaming console. Paul stared at him. Not rudely, not aggressively, just blankly. After a few seconds that stretched too long, Paul said, "We don't need our lawn mowed," and closed the door. Our grass was nearly 6 inches tall. "Why did you do that?" I asked. "I don't want a kid doing a half-decent job on our property," he said, already walking away. The words themselves weren't shocking. It was the way he said them. Flat, dismissive, like the kid hadn't been a person at all. More like an inconvenience. I let it go. Again. I always did. Winston was next. Our cat had been with us for 11 years at that point. Elderly, gentle, orange tabby, with a crooked tail from an injury before we adopted him. He mostly slept and ate and followed the warm spots in the house like a professional sun seeker. When he knocked over that glass of water, it was clearly an accident. I heard the shatter from the kitchen and rushed in. Paul was holding Winston by the scruff, not lifting him to move him, not restraining him to protect himself. Holding him up, eye level, staring. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice sharper than I meant it to be. "Making sure he understands," Paul said. I took Winston from him without asking. My hands were shaking. Winston bolted under the bed and didn't come out for hours. Paul cleaned the mess without a word. No apology, no explanation, just reset. Then there was the watch. My father's pocket watch had been my ritual. I opened the wooden box every few days, wound it even though I didn't carry it, listened to the tick like it was proof that some things survived loss. When it disappeared, something in me unraveled. I searched everywhere, over and over, my chest tight, my thoughts spiraling. Paul watched me from the bed, folding laundry. When he finally told me he'd moved it, for safekeeping, I felt foolish, relieved, and weirdly observed. Why let me panic? Why watch? And then there were the stories Paul told. The way he smiled while mimicking a coworker's voice cracking after being laid off. The way he shrugged at a homeless man's desperation. The way he stepped around a turtle on our hiking trail like it was an object, not a living thing trying to survive. Each moment alone could be explained. Together, they formed something else. A pattern. A quiet, accumulating sense that Paul didn't experience the world the way I did, or the way most people did. And underneath that realization was a fear I didn't want to name yet. What if I didn't actually know the man I was married to at all? Yesterday morning was supposed to be ordinary. Paul left for work at his usual time, 7:30 sharp. Coffee poured, mug rinsed, keys picked up in the same order he always used. He kissed my cheek, quick and automatic, already halfway out the door mentally before his body followed. I watched him leave from the kitchen window, the way I always did, and told myself I was being paranoid for counting how many seconds it took his car to disappear down the street. We were closed that day for inventory prep, so I had the house to myself. I vacuumed the living room first, then moved into the bedroom. It was quiet in that heavy, weekday morning way that makes every sound feel louder than it should be. The hum of the vacuum, the creak of the floorboards, the distant bark of a dog somewhere down the street. I was working along Paul's side of the bed when I noticed something dark peeking out from underneath. Just a corner. Black, matte, paper. I turned off the vacuum and crouched down, pulling it out with 2 fingers like it might bite me. It was a notebook. Black cover. Elastic band around it. Loose, stretched, like it had been pulled on too many times. I assumed it had fallen off Paul's nightstand. I didn't think journal. I thought work notes, numbers, lists, something boring. I stood up to put it back. The elastic slipped. The notebook fell open in my hands. And there, neat handwriting, perfectly spaced, was a date from 5 days ago. My name was in the first line. I froze. I know I shouldn't have read it. I know that. Even now, I tell myself that. But when you see your name written in someone else's private thoughts, something overrides etiquette. Curiosity isn't even the right word. It was instinct. Survival. The entry was about a conversation we'd had that morning. I remembered it clearly. I'd asked Paul if he could stop by the store after work to grab milk and bread. He'd said he couldn't. He had plans. I'd said, okay, I'd go myself. The whole exchange lasted maybe 30 seconds. No tension, no argument. According to the notebook, I'd been passive-aggressive, manipulative, making subtle digs, testing him. That wasn't what happened. My stomach tightened. I flipped the page. Another entry, then another. The date stretched back 4 months. One from 7 weeks ago described Winston knocking over the glass of water. Paul wrote that he'd wanted to throw the cat against the wall, that he didn't only because I was home. He described the urge like it was a physical sensation, pressure behind his eyes, heat in his chest. My hands started shaking so badly I had to sit on the floor. Another entry talked about a homeless man at an intersection. Paul wrote about wondering what would happen if he ran the red light, if the man would move in time. He didn't do it, not because it was wrong, but because there were other cars around. I felt cold, deeply, bone-deep cold. There were entries about coworkers, about hoping certain people would get fired so he could take their accounts, about imagining sabotaging presentations by deleting shared files, then deciding it was too risky. Then I found the one about the watch, my father's watch. Paul described taking it out of the wooden box and hiding it in his jewelry box on purpose. He wrote about watching my face as I searched for it. He used the word pathetic. He wrote that he let me look for a while longer, but eventually got bored. I couldn't breathe. The most recent entry, 3 days ago, was about the neighbor's kid. Paul wrote that he'd considered hiring him to mow the lawn and then refusing to pay him, just to see how the kid would react. He decided against it because it might cause problems with the neighbors. I sat there on the bedroom floor with that notebook open in my lap, my entire body trembling. This wasn't venting. This wasn't stress. This was someone cataloging ways to hurt people, to manipulate them, to observe their reactions like data points. Some entries were fantasies, some were actions. All of them were deliberate. I read until my eyes burned, until my chest hurt, until the pattern was undeniable. Paul wasn't having bad days. He wasn't socially awkward. He wasn't misunderstood. He was interested in suffering. I closed the notebook carefully, placed it back exactly where I'd found it, under the bed, like I was resetting a trap and praying it wouldn't snap shut on me. Then I stood up, finished vacuuming. Went about my day like nothing had happened. I bought milk and bread. I made dinner. I sat across from Paul at the table that evening, nodded at the right moments, asked about his day. The entire time I was thinking one thing. This is who he is when no one's watching. And I didn't know how to live with that knowledge, or what it meant for my safety if I stayed. The days after I found the notebook blurred together in a way that still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. Nothing changed on the surface. Paul woke up at the same time, drank the same coffee, complained about traffic, kissed my cheek before leaving for work. He asked if Winston had eaten. He reminded me about a dinner we had scheduled with friends the following week. And I smiled. I nodded. I played my role. Inside, I felt like I was standing on cracked ice, listening for the sound of it breaking. Every interaction felt staged now. Not just his, but mine. I watched his face more closely than I ever had, searching for micro-expressions, for slips, for the man I'd seen in those pages. Sometimes I caught glimpses of something that made my stomach drop, a flicker of irritation that disappeared too fast, a smile that came a beat late. Other times he seemed normal. That was the worst part. I kept asking myself if I was being dramatic, if I'd taken things out of context, if maybe writing things down really was a way to keep dark thoughts from becoming actions. But then I'd remember the watch, the way he watched me panic, the way he described my face. That wasn't therapy, that was enjoyment. At night, I lay awake, listening to Paul breathe beside me, slow, steady, relaxed. I wondered what he was thinking when he closed his eyes. I wondered how often he'd looked at me, not with love, not even with annoyance, but with curiosity, like a problem to solve. After almost a month of carrying it alone, I broke. It was a Tuesday evening. I came home from the store and found Paul already there, cooking dinner like nothing was wrong. The smell of garlic filled the kitchen. The normalcy of it felt obscene. "We need to talk," I said. Paul turned off the stove immediately. No hesitation, no annoyance. He sat at the kitchen table across from me, hands folded neatly, like he'd been expecting this. "Have you been keeping a journal?" I asked. "Yes. Where do you keep it?" "Usually under my side of the bed." My throat tightened. "I found it a few weeks ago. I read it." That was when his expression changed. Not panic, not guilt. Calculation. He stood up, walked to the bedroom, and came back with the notebook, placed it between us on the table. "Which parts?" he asked. "Enough." We sat there in silence for a long time. 10 minutes, maybe more. The clock on the wall felt unbearably loud. Finally, Paul spoke. He said the notebook was an outlet, a way to get thoughts out of his head so he wouldn't act on them. He used the phrase intrusive thoughts like he'd practiced it. "What kind of thoughts need that kind of outlet?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. Eventually, he admitted he'd had thoughts about hurting people, animals, manipulating situations. He said writing them down helped him manage them. I brought up the things he'd actually done. The watch, Winston. He acknowledged those too, calmly, like we were reviewing a list of chores he'd forgotten to finish. "Sometimes the urge is too strong," he said, "so I do something small." Small? I asked why he'd never told me. He said he knew how it would sound. "Everyone has dark thoughts," he said. I thought I was managing mine. I told him this went beyond normal dark thoughts, that the entries showed intent, pleasure, pattern. That's when he got defensive. He said I was overreacting, that he'd never seriously hurt anyone, that fantasies didn't count. I brought up specific entries. The cat, the homeless man, the coworkers. Those were just thoughts, he insisted. Writing them down kept me from acting. "What about the watch?" I asked quietly. "What about Winston?" He went silent. Then he said something I'll never forget. "Those things weren't that bad," he said, "compared to what I could have done." That was the moment something inside me went very still. He wasn't measuring his behavior against morality. He was measuring it against a worse version of himself, and congratulating himself for restraint. I asked if he'd ever considered professional help. He said no, said there was nothing wrong with him that required that. When I told him I needed time to think, he asked if I was going to leave. "I don't know," I said honestly. We spent the rest of the night in separate rooms. I locked myself in the spare bedroom with Winston. Paul stayed in the living room, the TV murmuring until late. The next morning, over coffee on the back porch, he told me he loved me, that he'd do whatever I needed. When I said he needed help, real help, he got upset, minimized, deflected, insisted again that thoughts didn't count. We went in circles for over an hour. Finally, I told him I was going to stay with my sister for a while. He asked me not to show anyone the notebook. I took it with me when I left, because something deep in my bones told me if I didn't hold on to the truth, he'd rewrite it. Living at my sister's house felt like stepping out of a fog I hadn't realized I was inside. The first night, I barely slept. Winston curled against my ribs, his purr loud and steady, like he was reminding both of us that we were safe, for now. My sister didn't push for details. She set up the guest room, handed me clean towels, and said, "Stay as long as you need." That kindness almost broke me. Paul started texting the next morning. At first, the messages were measured. Apologies, statements of understanding, promises to give me space. "I get why you're upset. Take the time you need. I love you." By day 3, the tone shifted. "When are you coming home? Can we meet somewhere neutral? Please just tell me you're okay." I didn't respond. I spent my days at the store, my hands moving through familiar tasks, while my mind replayed passages from the notebook on a loop. At night, I read it again, cover to cover this time. The entries I'd skimmed before now landed with full weight. There were dozens, hundreds of pages. One from 5 months ago described a dog in our neighborhood that barked constantly. Paul wrote about fantasizing in detail about poisoning it. He hadn't done it, but he'd mapped it out carefully. 2 full paragraphs, ingredients, timing. Another entry mentioned my sister. He wrote about how she asked too many questions and talked too much. He wrote a script of things he could say to permanently damage my relationship with her. He analyzed which phrasing would cause the most emotional harm. Reading them all at once was different. This wasn't stress. This wasn't venting. This was rehearsal. Paul's texts kept coming. By day 7, they were constant. He sent articles about intrusive thoughts, screenshots, quotes, links. It felt less like concern and more like a legal defense being assembled in real time. "See? This is normal. Lots of people have thoughts like this. You're letting fear distort things." I didn't answer any of it. Meanwhile, his family started reaching out. His mother called first. I let it go to voicemail. Then his sister texted, asking if we could clear up a misunderstanding. Friends reached out too, mutual friends, saying Paul seemed devastated, confused, blindsided. That was when I realized something terrifying. Paul hadn't told anyone the truth. He'd told a version, one where I was emotional, overreacting, sensitive, the woman who misread private thoughts, the woman who abandoned him. I saw the pattern clearly now, the same pattern he'd used on me for years. Control the narrative, stay pleasant, make the other person sound unreasonable. I stayed silent. 12 days after I left, my sister finally asked if something serious had happened. "Yes," I said, my voice shook. "I'm just not ready yet." She nodded. "When you are, I'll listen." A few days later, I went back to the house while Paul was at work. I told myself I was just getting clothes. Practical things. But the moment I stepped inside, my stomach twisted. The house felt wrong. Too quiet, too staged, like a set waiting for actors to return. I packed quickly. Clothes, books, personal items. And Winston, the moment I put him in the carrier, he went still. Didn't fight. Didn't cry. He'd never been that calm leaving the house before. It hit me then. He hadn't felt safe there either. Paul didn't object when I told him I'd taken the cat. That alone told me everything. Weeks passed. I read the notebook again and again. Each time, something new stood out. Subtle language choices, repeated phrases, the way Paul referred to people not as individuals, but as variables. Then, during another visit to pack more things, I found it. A second notebook. Same black cover, same elastic band. Older. Tucked into a box at the back of Paul's closet. My hands went numb as I opened it. The entries went back 12 years, to when we were dating. The early ones were less detailed, but the intent was the same. Paul wrote about testing me, about seeing how much anxiety he could create before I pushed back, about learning how to manage me. That word appeared over and over. Manage. There was an entry about lying to me about a weekend trip to see if I'd check up on him. When I didn't, he wrote that my trust would be useful later. Another about a financial disagreement, how he let me think I'd won, then quietly arranged things his way. He described the satisfaction of believing I felt secure while he controlled the outcome. Then there was the list. Pros and cons of marrying me. Pros: stable income, predictable, trusting, unlikely to challenge him. Cons: potentially boring over time. Marriage, he wrote, made sense logistically. I sat on the closet floor and cried until my chest hurt. 15 years. 15 years of believing I was in a partnership, while he'd been running an experiment. I took the second notebook with me. When I finally told my sister everything, I showed her the notebooks. She read about 20 pages before she had to stop. Something about him always felt rehearsed, she said quietly. I just didn't know why. That validation hurt almost as much as the truth. Paul noticed things going missing. He texted me asking if I'd been at the house, if I'd taken anything of his by mistake. I didn't reply. I met with a divorce attorney the following week. I brought both notebooks. The attorney skimmed them, then looked at me with something like concern. If this becomes contested, she said, these could matter. But if you're seeking a clean split, they may never come up. I told her I wanted out, cleanly, quietly. No revenge, no spectacle. Just freedom. The decision didn't come with relief right away, but it came with clarity. I didn't miss Paul. I missed the man I thought he was. And that man I was finally ready to accept never existed. The lowest point didn't come when I asked for the divorce. It came after, in the quiet space where there was no crisis left to manage, no immediate decision to make, no adrenaline to hide behind. Just me and the wreckage. I stayed at my sister's house while the paperwork began. Days stretched long and hollow. I went to work, smiled at customers, ran inventory like muscle memory could carry me through anything. At night, I lay in the guest bed staring at the ceiling, Winston tucked against my side, and felt something heavy settle into my bones. Grief. Not the sharp, dramatic kind. The dull kind that seeps in through cracks you didn't know were there. I grieved the marriage I thought I had. I grieved the years I couldn't get back. I grieved the version of myself who trusted without fear. Some nights, doubt crept in like a whisper. What if I overreacted? What if Paul was right and these were just thoughts? What if leaving was the more dangerous choice? Those questions scared me more than anything else because I could feel how badly I wanted them to be true. That's how people stay. I reread the notebooks when the doubt got loud, not out of obsession, but out of self-defense. Each time, my chest tightened all over again, the cruelty, the calculation, the absence of remorse. And still, part of me mourned him, because Paul hadn't been cruel all the time. He'd been consistent, reliable, present. He'd built routines with me, shared meals, shared holidays. 15 years of life doesn't vanish just because the foundation was rotten. I thought about our first apartment, the way we argued about paint colors, the nights we stayed up late watching bad movies. I wondered how many of those moments were real for him, or if he'd been observing me even then, filing reactions away. That uncertainty was its own kind of torture. The worst night came about 3 weeks after I left. I woke up gasping from a dream where I was back in the house, searching for my father's watch again. Only this time, Paul stood in the doorway smiling, telling me it was somewhere safe while the walls slowly closed in. I sat up shaking, heart pounding, Winston startled awake and meowing softly. That was when I realized something terrifying. I wasn't just afraid of Paul anymore. I was afraid around him, even in memory. That's not something love survives. I started avoiding places that reminded me of our life together. The Italian restaurant, the hiking trail, even the grocery store where we'd run into each other occasionally. I rearranged my days to minimize the chance of crossing paths. My sister noticed. You don't have to disappear, she said gently one evening. I know, I said, I just can't yet. Family started asking questions. Careful ones. My parents invited me to dinner and watched me like I might shatter if they spoke too loudly. My mother kept asking if I was eating enough. My father found excuses to stand beside me, silently supportive in the way only he knew how to be. Paul's parents called once. His mother cried, asked if we could try counseling, asked if something specific had happened. I told her my decision was final. When I hung up, my hands shook for an hour. The darkest thought, the one I hated myself for, came late one night as I lay awake listening to Winston purr. Maybe I should have stayed. Maybe it was safer to know the danger than to face the unknown. That was when I understood just how deeply Paul had reshaped my instincts over the years. I had been trained, subtly, patiently, to doubt myself. That realization hurt more than anything else. I cried quietly into Winston's fur, my tears dampening his orange coat, and whispered an apology to myself for not seeing it sooner, for staying when my body had been warning me, for calling control calm and manipulation practicality. I wasn't just ending a marriage. I was dismantling a belief system. And standing there, stripped of certainty, exhausted, and grieving a life that turned out to be a performance, I felt completely alone. That was my darkest moment. Not because I wanted Paul back, but because I wasn't yet sure I trusted myself without him. The turning point didn't arrive as a dramatic revelation. It came quietly, through repetition. One afternoon, about a month after I left, I sat at my sister's kitchen table with both notebooks spread out in front of me. Sunlight slanted across the pages, catching the ink in a way that made the handwriting look almost alive. I'd read them so many times by then that I could predict certain phrases before my eyes landed on them. And suddenly I wasn't reacting anymore. I was observing. The emotional punch dulled just enough for something else to step in. Clarity. Paul's writing followed patterns, not just in content, but in structure. He framed himself as an observer. Everyone else, me included, was an object, a stimulus, a response. There was no language of guilt, no reflection that led toward accountability, only curiosity, satisfaction, boredom. That's when I understood something important. Paul wasn't confused about who he was. He was comfortable. The discomfort had only started when I found out. That realization stripped away the last of my hesitation. I met Paul 2 Saturdays later to talk about separating permanently. I chose the house. Neutral ground felt impossible. He opened the door, looking thinner, tired, eyes slightly red like he hadn't been sleeping well. "Are you moving back?" he asked. "No," I said. "I'm here to talk about divorce." He started crying immediately. Not quietly, not with restraint. He collapsed onto the kitchen chair, hands covering his face, shoulders shaking. He said he'd been hoping I just needed time to cool off. He said he'd thrown away the notebook like he promised. "It doesn't matter," I said calmly. "I have it." His head snapped up. Surprise flickered across his face before he masked it. We sat in the living room. I told him what I wanted. A clean split. Sell the house. Divide everything evenly. No fights. No dragging this out. "I just want out," I said, as cleanly as possible. He cycled through emotions fast. Tears, anger, bargaining, back to tears. He said I was throwing away 15 years over thoughts. He insisted again that he'd never seriously hurt anyone. I brought up Winston. The watch. The years of manipulation documented in the second notebook. "That's all being blown out of proportion," he snapped. "Read any journal long enough and you'll find ugly things." "Have you read yours recently?" I asked. He didn't answer. When I asked when he had started writing, he said, "Around the time we got married." 9 years. 9 years of curated cruelty. That sealed it. Nothing he said after that reached me. I felt strangely calm, like my body had already processed the danger and switched into evacuation mode. He asked how we'd tell people. "We'll say we grew apart," I said. "We don't need to explain more than that." He agreed quickly. Too quickly. I moved forward. I told my sister everything, showed her both notebooks. She read until her face went pale, then pushed them away. "This isn't just dark thinking," she said. "This is someone who enjoys control." Hearing it from someone else mattered more than I expected. I told my parents we were divorcing, gave them the sanitized version. My mother didn't believe it, but she didn't push. My father said they'd support whatever decision I made. Paul's parents called. His mother begged. His father listened quietly, then accepted it. That contrast spoke volumes. I hired a real estate agent. The house went on the market. Offers came in faster than I expected. I found a 1-bedroom apartment 15 minutes from the store. Small, bright, mine. The day I signed the lease, something shifted inside me. For the first time in months, my stomach didn't clench when I thought about the future. I wasn't running anymore. I was choosing. That night, I put the notebooks in a box and taped it shut. Not to hide them, but to mark them as past tense. Evidence of something I'd survived. Paul asked once if I hated him. "No," I said honestly. "I don't know who you are, and that's worse." He cried again, said he was still the same man I married. I didn't argue. I didn't need to. Because my turning point wasn't about convincing him of anything. It was about believing myself. And once that clicked, there was no going back. The fallout didn't explode all at once. It unfolded slowly, methodically, like gravity finally asserting itself after years of suspension. Once the decision was made, everything moved with an efficiency that surprised even me. Paul and I divided the house into categories. What was his? What was mine? What we'd sell? What we'd donate? We worked side by side in near silence. Like coworkers finishing a project neither of us wanted to acknowledge emotionally. He took most of the furniture. I didn't argue. I didn't want objects heavy with memory. I took the kitchen items I'd brought into the marriage, my books, a few framed photos I hadn't realized I still cared about, and Winston. Paul didn't fight me on that. Not once. That absence of resistance felt louder than any argument could have been. The house sold within weeks. A young couple with a baby bought it. They were smiling during the final walkthrough, talking about nursery colors and future plans. I stood in the doorway and watched them, realizing the house itself was innocent. It had simply held whatever we put inside it. At the closing, Paul sat across from me, eyes down, hands folded. We signed papers, exchanged neutral pleasantries. 15 years reduced to signatures and stamped pages. The divorce finalized 5 months after I asked for it. No drama, no courtroom theatrics, no last-minute confessions. Just done. Paul moved into an apartment on the other side of town, bigger than mine. He needed space, I suppose. Room to stage a life that still looked normal from the outside. He texted twice after the papers were signed. Once to ask for the internet provider's number. Once to tell me he'd found some of my forwarded mail. I answered the first, ignored the second. He left the envelope taped to my apartment door. I didn't thank him. My family adjusted in their own careful way. My parents invited me over more often. My sister brought her daughters to help me move in. The girls played with Winston, laughing when he chased string across the floor. The older one asked where Paul was. "We're not married anymore," I said. She frowned. "Why?" My sister gently changed the subject. Later, she said, "They liked him." "I know," I said. "A lot of people did." That was part of the problem. The holidays were hard. Thanksgiving without Paul felt wrong in a way that was both painful and relieving. My mother hovered. My father checked in quietly. I appreciated it, but it drained me. Work became my refuge. My employees didn't ask questions. One of the guys who'd worked with me for 6 years just said, "Sorry to hear about it," and left it at that. I thanked him more sincerely than he probably realized. 2 weeks after the divorce finalized, I ran into Paul at the grocery store. Produce section. Apples. We made eye contact. "Hi," he said. "Hi." He asked how I was. I said fine. He commented that Winston probably liked having more space. I said he was adjusting well. 90 seconds. That was it. My hands shook for 10 minutes afterward. Not because I missed him, but because my body remembered being on alert. I'd won my freedom, but my nervous system hadn't caught up yet. People expected some kind of visible collapse from Paul. They expected him to unravel publicly, to lash out, to lose friends. He didn't. He stayed polite, pleasant, controlled. But things changed anyway. Friends drifted. Conversations stalled. Invitations slowed. Not because anyone knew the truth, but because something about him no longer had a buffer. Without me there to soften his edges, to translate his flatness into practicality, people felt the hollowness more clearly. His parents stopped calling me. His sister did too. I didn't chase closure. I didn't expose him. I didn't hand the notebooks to anyone except my lawyer and my sister. I didn't need revenge. The truth had already done its work. Meanwhile, my life quietly expanded. I moved into my apartment, bought a new couch, hung photos that belonged only to me. I joined a bowling league with coworkers, even though I was terrible at it. I went hiking alone and noticed how different the trail felt without needing to match someone else's pace. I started attending a divorce support group on Tuesday nights. I listened more than I spoke. When I did talk, I kept it simple. My ex-husband wasn't who I thought he was. People nodded. They always did. I started dating again. Slowly. Carefully. Coffee, not commitments. One man asked questions. Another didn't push when I said I wasn't ready to share. I appreciated that more than grand gestures. The notebooks stayed in a box in my closet. Some nights I considered throwing them away. Other nights I understood why I wasn't ready. They weren't weapons. They were anchors. Proof that I hadn't imagined any of it. That leaving wasn't cruelty. It was survival. Paul didn't fall apart. But he didn't win either. He lost the one thing he couldn't control. Me.